really honored to be presenting here at the Barsan Research Forum. I have some things to disclose. None of it's dirty. You can all read faster than I can talk, even though I try to talk pretty fast. So it's recorded, so that's very good. So we'll take a step back. So this morning Bill was talking about some of his experiences. Here I am, about 10 years out of residency, and back in 2005, I actually was thinking I think I want to do a research fellowship, which was sort of this bizarre idea. I hadn't really learned much about research. Bill wasn't offered a neurology rotation in medical school at The Ohio State University. I just didn't go to my neurology rotation at the University of Cincinnati, which is almost a true story. I did receive a passing grade, but I actually sat down and had a discussion with John Younger while I was on the phone about I want to do research, and that was what brought me here. So what I've been tasked with is to provide a bit of the description of the Neurological Emergencies Treatment Trials Network, which my initial part in was basically choosing to come to Michigan and then being a part of this sort of fantastic platform for learning about acute care in neurology. Part two, I'm going to describe a little bit about the clinical trials methodology course, which I am director of for NINDS. And I'll talk very briefly about dizziness, because I know you all love hearing about dizziness. In 15 minutes, yeah, right. You got the cards, right? You'll tell me when I've got 5 minutes. Okay, fine. So a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, Bill talked about this, but I will sort of summarize it in a bit of a different way. Stroke physicians have been stymied for decades without any acute treatments to improve outcomes by reducing the damage from stroke. It was bad. They looked to their colleagues, the cardiologists, for help, but they met many roadblocks. And Bill Barsan, who was Obi-Wan Kenobi, and John Meurer from NINDS actually got together. And really they did something that was transformative in that they decided that the only way to do stroke trials was to get emergency medicine involved. He sort of, I think, minimized his involvement a little bit. I'll sort of maximize it. And Yoda here talked to him and was like, hey, what's the fastest after onset you think you could get somebody in a stroke trial? And Bill's like, I don't know, 90 minutes? And voila, they demanded and actually wrote into the study design that half the patients in the NINDS TPA trial had to be enrolled within 90 minutes. And that was because they knew that time was important. Biologically, we know that time is important. Yet, all the trials that were concurrently going on in Europe, they're like, it's Europe. Nobody will get in 3 hours. Let's do 6 hours. And when you hear that there were 10 negative thrombolytic trials, it was the European trials where they were enrolling everybody at 5 hours. But through Bill's leadership and Dr. Marler, they figured out how to do study design right. And as Bob sort of brought at the beginning, what's your hypothesis? So one of my sort of central tenets is that the most important way for us to learn what works is to do randomized controlled trial. And the most important thing about doing randomized controlled trials is designing them right. And in that one, Bill would describe that they got lucky, and that a lot of what he talked about later in his talk was, instead of being lucky, be good and design your trials in such a way that you learn the right things and you ask the right questions. We don't do enough clinical trials. Upon that, we actually don't do enough clinical trials that are actually helpful and provide us with an answer at the end. A couple of trials from the Neurological Emergencies Treatment Trials Network. The net sort of formed after, basically after the Death Star was destroyed and stroke was turned from a disease where you parked people up in the units to get rehab to a disease that could be treated by TPA. The entire network that had sort of got together to destroy the Death Star of doing nothing for stroke sort of broke up and didn't, it's kind of when you come back to these new Star Wars movies and the whole Rebel Alliance things were going well, but then everything sort of broke up and they have this planet that shoots deathly rays. And so anyway, that had sort of happened. So they set up the net to bring back that network and to re-engage emergency medicine in terms of dealing with neurologic disease, because those diseases have to be treated so quickly. Rampart, which was a trial of status epilepticus in the field, was the first trial that NET completed, and it was done, Robert Silverglate, who is in Hawaii, was the principal investigator, and that was a trial that looked at intramuscular midazolam versus intravenous lorazepam for status epilepticus in the field. It was completed early, showed that intramuscular midazolam was superior, and was very much a transformative study. PROTECT was looking at progesterone in traumatic brain injury, and that was one of the largest TBI studies that was done. Progesterone didn't work. I have a long description of why that perhaps was an issue with the design, but I'm not going to talk about that here. Ongoing trials, Alex was talking about ESET. Do you have seizures? If you're reading this, you probably don't have a seizure right now, but SHINE is a trial of glycemic control in acute ischemic stroke, and POINT is a trial of dual antiplatelet therapy for minor stroke and TIA. So this is what they're doing, some of the most important trials in the country in the neurologic space, and as it turns out, there's just some sort of common themes about randomized controlled trials. So NET is potentially transitioning to a new network that is going to broaden the scope from just neurological diseases to cardiac diseases, trauma, through something called the Siren Network, and that's something that we're actively working on writing a grant for June 1st for. So that will be hopefully the next chapter of this, and Michigan's leadership in this area cannot be underestimated. So, I mean, randomized controlled trials. What I'm saying is we need to do more randomized controlled trials. This is a lot of what I've dedicated my career to. They're not easy. It's hard to get into. Particularly in the medical school, site investigators often don't get enough recognition or props, but those are the people who really get these things done, as Bill can attest to. So if we want to collect unbiased information that we're truly sort of addressing that scientific method that Dr. Newmar spoke of, well, I wasn't here stuffing 20 years worth of kids into the back of my sedan, but I was on my way. I was just running a little late because they weren't cooperating. So but this is the scientific method. There's just not enough of these trials being done, but it's the best way to get definitive answers that are less biased. So switching gears, it's really hard to do these clinical trials. If you think the large clinical trials we're doing are hard and they require a lot of organization, something that's even harder is doing the small clinical trials at the beginning where you sort of make a case that I should be studying this next, and the government should be giving me a fair bit of money to do this large clinical trial. This is a lot of what Bill has talked about with the adaptive designs. We don't really know what to pick to move to those large trials, and a lot of it is because we do somewhat dumb trials in the early space, and we often provide our junior investigators with the least amount of resources and the most junior biostatisticians to help them design experiments in that space. And designing the experiments in the early clinical trials is really the hard part. So it's these same sort of problems. There's just not enough of these being done, and this was identified as a problem by NINDS, and they set up this course that we applied for a grant and got. So what we do is we actually have a specific process where we use small groups, and we have a process where when people are designing their trials, we get biostatisticians who've designed neurological trials in there to talk about the design early, along with clinicians who've designed trials before. We have a sort of big, large group meeting here in Ann Arbor, and then we continue to use those small groups to iteratively develop their clinical trial protocols. And the idea is, what is the most that you can learn with 20 patients or so with your disease? What is the randomization going to be? Is there going to be randomization? Is it better to set something up as a proportion? I did a pilot study of handing out blood pressure cuffs in the emergency department, and we set our primary outcome. How many people actually went home with that blood pressure cuff and texted us back? What is that proportion? That was the primary analysis of our trial, is what proportion of people would text us back a hypertensive blood pressure if we handed them a blood pressure cuff and some instructions. So does anybody know what we found on that? I didn't report it yet, but guess how many people would say, you see them in the emergency department, they have high blood pressure, we hand them a blood pressure cuff, and we also enroll them in a study and say, text us back. What do you think? 10%. So we set a pre-specified goal that it needed to be greater than 33%, because the blood pressure cuffs are $20. We thought that would be a reasonable diagnostic yield. So that was the bar that we have to go over. But actually 54% of people texted back and were still hypertensive. About 60% of people actually texted back once, they just weren't hypertensive. So we learned something very useful in that. But you can see that if you had set that study up in a way where you just gave out the blood pressure cuffs, and at the end you were looking at a difference between groups, you would have had a very small number. And for this, I learned something that was very important, and we've turned that into a future grant submission. So, the third item that I wanted to talk about is dizziness. This is collaboration with Kevin Kerber. You know, the University of Michigan has been a great place for me. I've met a lot of really smart people, and it has been just a delight to work with them. So if you do emergency medicine and you have a med.umich.edu email address, you can go to this website, distink.org, and we will teach you how to take care of people in the emergency department with benign paroxysmal positional vertigo, which is awesome. And I think you will be transformed by this. Some of you have looked at this website. I know. I can see you out there. So you've been transformed by it. So I'm putting it out there. You know, I don't blame you if you're from peds, if you don't want to do it. There's not that many kids with it, but some, although most of them have had trauma. So with that, I think those are the main things I wanted to cover. You know, sort of in summary, you know, clinical trials are good. I've had the unique opportunity here at the University of Michigan to be involved with clinical trials. Doing research is fun. It's fun to go out there and discover stuff. As Bill said, this allows you to touch more than the patients that you are individually seeing in a way that is good. And I'm happy to answer questions. Sure. So the idea for the protocol development course is first we develop a scientific protocol, which is like how you do the experiment. Then you would develop a proposal, unless you just happen to be like independently wealthy like Mark Zuckerberg or something. It's like, oh yeah, I can just pay for this clinical trial. But the protocol is the scientific experiment part. So typically the rule that we would use is people who are in sort of faculty positions who would end up being the PI of that trial ultimately. So like we use generally the criterion is if you're the first author on the publication for that trial, or you would be the PI on the IRB application, then you would be eligible to take that course. We focus on neurological problems. They don't have to be neurological emergencies. They can be chronic diseases as well. But that's the target audience. It's not. It's so that the people, the junior clinical trialists, learn about putting together all of those things. And who I learned the most about putting together protocols and actually putting together trials that work were actually the clinical research nurses, the clinical project managers who I worked with in some of the, you know, as I was a site investigator here. You know, sometimes there's a sort of expectation as a junior faculty member is like, oh yeah, I'm setting up a clinical trial. And then you have like a very junior research assistant who's going to think that the investigator actually knows what they're doing. But oftentimes, even though I have a master's degree in clinical research design and statistical analysis, the amount of that deals with the sort of nuts and bolts of doing an FDA-regulated trial is very limited, and that's more of an apprenticeship. And this course sort of bridges that gap to you can make a plausible protocol that you can submit to the FDA and is going to be compliant with all regulations and get you a really good, useful answer. That's a very long-winded answer too, but hopefully that helped. Other questions?
Any questions?
All right. Thank you very much.